My name is Patricia Davis. Thank you for this exceptional opportunity to share my thoughts on memory, which underlies in various ways many of the events that shape the world as we know it and that informs much of my work as an academic. I would like to speak more specifically about the global movements to remove monuments to white supremacy, a set of social actions that have drawn greater attention with the reinvigoration of the Black Lives Matter movement. This movement presents excellent illustrations of the ways in which our memories are shaped through processes of negotiation. I'll begin with the quote that speaks quite eloquently to the power of the past. It's a gem of wisdom among many such gems from the great artist intellectual James Baldwin. I quote, "History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations." Baldwin penned this quote in an essay published in Ebony magazine in 1965, the year of the Watts riots and the assassination of Malcolm X, as well as the passage of the Voting Rights Act. It is times like that, when momentous events are unfolding, that we tend to offer our most intense reflections on the influence of history on the ways in which we see ourselves. As Baldwin's words make clear, history impacts not only who we are, but everything we do, from our voting preferences to our willingness to take vaccines. It is on this function of history in the formation of identity that I will focus, as it is important to understand memory as a process of negotiation. Before I go into specific examples, I'll clarify my usage of three interrelated concepts. First, it is important to make the distinction between history and memory. History is conceived of as a set of objective facts about what happened, when it happened, and why it happened. It focuses on people, places, dates, and events. While history is largely based on provable facts, and although most people tend to assign a lot of authority to history, it is not 100% objective. The reliance of professional historians on documented sources contained in archives means that our historical knowledge is incomplete, only a partial record with many absences. Furthermore, the historical data that make it into records are subject to differing interpretations, with something as simple as a word or phrase, emphasis or de-emphasis, affecting the way a particular historical event may be read. Political battles over school history textbooks and the recent controversy centered on the New York Times' 1619 project are but two examples that illustrate this point. Nevertheless, generally speaking, history is relatively neutral in its primary reliance on objective facts. Memory, on the other hand, is based on history, but is much more overtly socially constructed. In other words, it relies less on what happened than what is said to have happened, in the words of the late anthropologist Michel Rolph-Trouillot. Memories are made from our interpretations of historical events, including our perspectives on their meanings in the present and their impact on the future. It is comprised of historical narratives and myths that are useful at particular points in time and for specific ends. Memories are passed down over generations through a variety of forms that include, but also lie outside of, official sources of history. Examples of these include monuments, historical performances, film, museums, and the myriad other sources through which most people attain their historical knowledge. All of these features mean that memories are the products of negotiation. These processes of negotiation bring us to the two other relevant concepts. One involves social identity. Memory is one of the features that comprises our identities, and because it is socially constructed, it is an important element of our social identities. I'll explain what I mean by the term social identity. Our social identity refers to the ways a person sees her or himself based on perceived membership in particular groups. These groups, or social categories, are often based on physical or physiological characteristics such as race, gender, ethnicity, ability, and age. But we also define ourselves as members of collectivities using non-physical or physiological measures such as religion, sexuality, and socioeconomic class. Generally, we have some emotional attachment to our social identity as it provides us a sense of belonging, which in turn offers us a basis for our self-esteem. A significant aspect of this work involves people categorizing a complex social world by identifying the groups to which they personally belong and othering groups to which they do not, creating an in-group versus out-group dynamic. Much of what people do involves increasing the status of their social group, which is sometimes accomplished through decreasing the social status of other groups. Memory is particularly useful to this goal as the memories groups construct from historical events, either consciously or unconsciously, are typically going to be those that cast our social group in the most favorable light. They are also useful in that they enable these in-groups to attribute negative memories to out-groups or to marginalize or erase the memories of those groups altogether, particularly if they happen to conflict with the more favorable memories in-groups ascribe to themselves. This brings us to the third concept, which involves power. In-groups are typically empowered to make the historical narratives favorite to themselves attain the status of dominant or official memories of the entire community or society. Because of their status as the dominant group, they are able to control the means of historical production. The archival institutions, monuments, films, books, and other instruments of memory that determine what is remembered and what is forgotten, erased, or silenced. These mechanisms enable powerful groups to mobilize history as a means of maintaining their status and diminishing the status of non-dominant groups. Positive stories are crucial to shaping triumphal identities. And of course, representation is a very important part of this. It corresponds to questions about whose interpretations of history, whose memories are elevated via mass representation to the status of official, accepted, quote unquote, common sense knowledge. Now, one thing to keep in mind about power relations is that they are fluid, changing to various degrees as different social identity groups gain power, whether that power is political or economic. The attainment of political and economic power typically leads to the attainment of social power. So, as marginalized groups achieve some status, they are able to negotiate the means through which their historical experiences may be represented as public memories in influential and meaningful ways. And to reiterate this important point, representation is critical to the construction of memory, as it is one of the primary means through which a group's experiences acquire currency and are passed down. Because of the relationship of memory to identity, when a group's memories are represented in public ways, it constitutes a statement of belonging. It is for this reason and others that memory is always shaped by the needs of the present. One additional crucial point here. When it comes to the intersection of memory, identity, and power, it is important to emphasize the role of national identity, which often corresponds to social identity along lines of race, ethnicity, and gender. All societies have repertoires of narratives and myths that comprise national memories. These memories sustain a sense of collective consciousness tied to the idea that its citizens, regardless of other group differences, are all part of a national community. Non-dominant groups may have memories that exist in tension with those that comprise the official memories critical to the conception of nation, and recovering those memories requires processes of negotiation that are often fraught because of this tension. Now, I provide these conceptual relationships as the basis for the specific examples I will discuss very shortly. But first, I'll describe the contextual foundation in a bit more detail. My discussion of memory will focus on the ways in which African American experiences of the past have informed the processes of negotiation that underlie the construction and representation of memory. As I mentioned earlier, social identity is based on many categories, with race being one of them. Memory plays a significant role instructing race as a salient social category in the US, as the history of racial hierarchy and the memories of it have constructed and sustained a sense of group identity based on race. And in the US, identities based on race and nation are intertwined. As is the case in most countries, the stories about America's founding serve as means of maintaining a sense of shared identity among the people who live here, and in many ways, teach us the values and beliefs deemed necessary to being good citizens. To be more specific, these memories have seeded the beliefs that the US was founded on the ideals of liberty, freedom, and equality, and that it has been inexorably on the path toward fulfilling these ideals for all of its citizens. Yes, there have been a few bumps along the way, so the narrative goes, but the notion that society has been on a linear trajectory of progress, that it is an inherently good, beneficent, and inclusive national community, and that America is exceptional in this regard, is supported by national memories that have been well represented over time and have attained the status of common sense as a result. For example, generations of school children have learned via history textbooks that the country was founded on the desire for religious freedom and escape from tyranny, that it became wealthy as the sole result of modernization, the ingenuity of its capitalist class, and the hard work of its citizens, that the wars in which the US has engaged have been fought for the cause of spreading democracy and freedom all over the world. The list goes on and on. To the extent that the country's failures in its commitment to its stated ideals are acknowledged, they are framed as momentary lapses and interwoven into the broader narratives of reconciliation and redemption important to the notion of American exceptionalism. Many of the more troubling events of history, those that would complicate or threaten America's dominant view of itself, have been whitewashed or erased altogether. These leave the important uncritical linear assumptions of history intact. These are the narratives that function to unify a vast and diverse people as Americans and encourage them to see themselves as members of a national community. But there are significant intersections between these memories and racial identity. They contribute to the construction of a white social identity that is not only at the center of history, including all of the institutions, events, and innovations that have established and maintained the nation's economic and ideological dominance, but that also positions white Americans as inherently benevolent and innocent people. The experiences and contributions of people of color have been marginalized, and the historical events and institutions that have resulted in racial inequities in the past and present have been obscured. As is the case with the broader national identity, many of the more negative memories that might threaten white racial identity have been forgotten or silenced, enabling whiteness to maintain an image of goodness in spite of an extensive history of racial violence, subjugation, and hierarchy. This is but one of the ways in which white social identity has attained and maintained its value through the diminution of the social identities of people who are not white. We are seeing the endurance of these assumptions even now as the violence enacted in response to a free and fair presidential election that deposed an openly white supremacist administration have, again, resulted in proclamations that this is not who we are. This highlights the strategic forgetting of similar violence perpetrated at various times throughout history, whenever the racial status quo has been threatened, as memories of these events have been eliminated from our national consciousness. This includes those that point to the systemic failure to address racial inequities, which would undermine images of America's presumed greatness. African American memory serves as a counter-narrative to these assumptions. Black history has always presented challenges to the precepts underlying American exceptionalism and the white social identity underlying it. So, the memories of Black historical experiences and the ways in which they are represented in public places are inherently ideological. In other words, they are often subversive memories, narratives that speak truth to power. It is for this reason that projects designed to place Black history at the center of our consciousness, like the New York Times' 1619 Project did, have been controversial. It is also why they have spurred reactions to these corrections, with the 1776 Commission being a case in point. As is the case with national identity and white racial identity, African Americans' sense of collective consciousness is formed and sustained in part through shared history. The Africans who were brought here to the US were made up of culturally heterogeneous groups of people who eventually came to see themselves as part of a collectivity through the shared experiences of enslavement, and this group identity exists in many forms today. The shared memories of African Americans are made up of stories of people whose names are known, and many more who are unknown, who have made contributions to the nation and done so while engaged in a continuous struggle to overcome the legacies of slavery. The history of the civil rights movement presents an excellent example of the tensions between white-centered national memories and African American memory. The movement has been held up as an example of America's assumed exceptional ability to correct unequal social systems, with the region of the country in which these social systems were most flagrant and the people connected to it being positioned as not quite representative of the country as a whole. The endurance of these dominant memories is reliant in part on the myth-making surrounding the movement's most high profile figures. However, if one disregards this particular self-serving redemption narrative and instead centers the stories of the many unheralded African Americans who were the foot soldiers of the movement and those of the implacable cruelty and violence that characterized it, as well as the complete personal stories of those who were its drivers, a more complex narrative emerges to trouble this interpretation. For example, I often discuss the civil rights movement in a communication and inclusion course I teach, and it is always interesting to me that so many students have no idea about Rosa Parks' background. Many of them learn in school that she was simply an individual Black woman who was returning home on the bus from work and that she was too tired to stand for, or at best was perhaps just fed up with the unfairness of having to give up her seat. When I tell them of her history of activism and make clear that her actions that day were the result of a strategic plan of organized resistance, they're surprised. Now, it seems at first that this misconception is relatively harmless, but when you look a little bit deeper, you can see that it is not harmless, as it devalues the agency of Black people via organized resistance in securing their own freedom, and obscures the relentless violence that both spurred and met civil rights activism. It also performs the work of diminishing the magnitude of African Americans' determination to assert their citizenship and resist the infringement on their freedoms as Americans, as well as the strategic ingenuity required to accomplish these objectives. All of these myths function to elevate white social identity by devaluing Black social identity. And again, representation is key here, as it operates not only to recover true memories, but also as a statement about the relative power of social groups. For example, the history of lynching has always presented one of the biggest challenges to the idea of American exceptionalism, and it undercuts assumptions of the essential goodness and moral authority of white Americans. While this history has not been completely erased, it has been misrepresented in line with these assumptions. The dominant narrative of lynching suggests that the murders were committed as extrajudicial punishment for crimes that the victims, the overwhelming majority of them Black, were accused of having committed. It is also obvious that this narrative serves the purpose of constructing memories highlighting the actions of unsavory individuals who were just, perhaps understandably, taking the law into their own hands. As a child growing up in Virginia and even into adulthood, to the extent that this history was even superficially covered, this is the story about lynching that I received. Though I'd long known that this was a false narrative, it was only when I visited the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, a project of the Equal Justice Initiative, an organization founded and headed by an African-American man, that I got the full picture. Not only does the memorial offer visitors a more comprehensive understanding of lynching, including the real reasons for the murders and the implication of entire societies in the crimes, it also demonstrates the continuities among lynching, capital punishment, and contemporary police violence against African Americans. More importantly, it centers representation on many of the greatest atrocities in US history and does so through centering African American memory. Representation matters and is why the actions of the people who are working to bring these memories to light is so important. Black History Museum officials and other archivists, filmmakers, writers, and other historical producers have important roles to play. So now I'll turn to the more detailed discussion of the removal of Confederate monuments, which has spurred widespread discussion about the uses and abuses of history and offers lessons about the ways in which memories are negotiated. One of the most momentous events in 2020 concerned the aftermath of the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and many others too numerous to name. Of the various social actions taken as part of the reinvigoration of the Black Lives Matter movement and the most recent racial reckoning it has spurred, the removal of Confederate monuments from their prominent spaces in towns and cities has been among the most intriguing. Many of these monuments have been standing for 100 years or more, and after decades of unsuccessful efforts to remove them, it raises questions about what made the current movement so ripe for success. But first, a little history about these monuments. Shortly after the Civil War ended, white Southerners were looking for redemption for a war that they had lost and calculated that, though they had been defeated in battle, they could win in terms of shaping the memory of the war. As part of this redemption narrative, which is fueled by the desire to foster a reconciliation with the North, they recast the war as having been fought not over slavery, but rather over the desire to defend themselves against a federal government attempting to encroach upon their God-given rights. The soldiers and generals who fought for the Confederacy were thus noble, honorable men who fought not to keep people enslaved, but rather for the good cause of protecting hearth and home. Thus began a campaign on the part of groups such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and other organizations to erect monuments to Confederate generals such as Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Nathan Bedford Forrest, as well as statues celebrating the nameless soldiers who fought for what was termed the lost cause. In their writings and during the numerous dedication ceremonies that were held at the unveiling of the monuments, the objectives in doing so were made clear. These structures were meant to not only honor the fallen, but also to educate future generations of school children about the desired interpretation of the war, its causes and consequences. A significant element in these narratives is the notion that slavery was good for Black people, or at least wasn't so bad, and that enslaved persons were treated well, in some cases like family members, and really didn't desire the freedom that white men and women took as their own birthright. Let's look at the identity work this revisionism performs. It essentially turns a people who are historical villains by any objective measure into heroes by reconstructing memories in a way that lessens the severity of their greed, selfishness, and humanity, repositions their war making as noble, and diminishes the generational impact on their victims. An important element of this narrative is that the Civil War was fought not over slavery, but over states' rights, and the good white people of the South would have emancipated their slaves eventually. They were never actually forced to do so through defeat in a bloody war. These narratives enable the social identity based on whiteness to sustain its innocence, its moral authority, its currency into the contemporary moment. One can still see shades of this work in some of the memory structures today, with plantation house museums as a prime example. Though there have been significant attempts over the last few years to present a more complicated interpretation of antebellum life on the guided tours of these museums, there are still some that focus the bulk of their presentations on the ornateness of the homes and the elegance and gentility of the lives the elite families led. There is very little, if any, mention of those whose unending labor made this elegance possible, much less the social system that enforced it. This is because when someone embarks on a tour of a plantation home, she or he is not paying to hear stories that might diminish her or his social identity, but one that, at the very least, does no harm. These narratives operate further to diminish Black social identity by erasing the historical context for contemporary inequalities. It's no secret that there are disparities in income, wealth, educational attainment, health outcomes, policing, and other measures of well-being. An observer who lacks awareness of the impact of historical oppression on present conditions would be inclined to see these inequities as the result of stereotypical cultural pathologies, such as an assumed lack of a strong work ethic, bad health habits, or an aversion to education, rather than a history of structural oppression as the culprit. This observer might then oppose or resent public policies designed to address these disparities. Now, multiply this observation by millions, and the material consequences of this diminution of Black social identity via memory become apparent. Furthermore, in a society in which citizenship and belonging are implicitly connected not only to race, but also to perceptions of success, it is easy to see how the erasure of memories of slavery and its many legacies contributes to perceptions of African Americans as perpetual outsiders. The representation of African American memories can help mitigate these impacts. And I want to make clear that although Black social identity is rooted in shared experiences of the trauma of slavery, it is not one of victimization, but rather based on a multifaceted set of experiences, as is the case with all group identities. Now, it's important to note the timing of the myth-making activities enacted through Confederate memorials, as most were erected during an era in which African Americans were subject to the cruelties of the Jim Crow social system. So the educational function of these monuments certainly extended to them as well. In venerating those who had fought to keep them enslaved, the structure sent the message to Black people that their own historical experiences did not matter and served as material reminders to them that their place was, and presumably always would be, at the bottom of the racial hierarchy that characterized the South and the rest of the country. Additional monuments were later erected during the decades of the Civil Rights Movement, when African American demands for equality posed threats to the prevailing racial order. The message implicated in these monuments was one of resistance to equality. Even the few monuments that were constructed to honor emancipation, such as those erected in Washington, D.C. in 1876 and in Boston in 1879, reinforced messages of Black inferiority through presenting President Lincoln as a godlike savior and enslaved persons as supplicants who played no role and thus had no agency in securing their own freedom. So even the minimal efforts to memorialize the war from an African-American perspective preserve the primacy of white social identity and assumptions of American exceptionalism. It is also important to note the locations of these monuments, which speaks to the communicative aspects of these structures. Most of them were built in strategically prominent public spaces where they could be seen on a daily basis by residents and visitors alike. Monuments that are located in such spaces operate to not only elevate and venerate particular memories over other possible interpretations, but because of the connection between memory and identity, they also communicate the presumed values of the entire community. They are often quite imposing in terms of their size, with the figures of Confederate generals typically standing on large pedestals and sculpted into triumphal postures, as if they are watching over those who pass beneath them. Through their locations and their structural features, these statues convey racialized messages of belonging and of exclusion. Today, there are thousands of Confederate monuments sprinkled all over the US. Most of them are located in the South, but there are also some in places such as California, New Jersey, Wisconsin, and other non-Southern states. Here, I speak only about statues to Confederate generals and anonymous soldiers, as well as obelisks. But the numbers are even higher when you include other memorial structures, such as school, building, military base, street and highway names, and commemorative plaques. All of these monuments promote a white social identity that is premised on the subjugation of African Americans and the devaluation of Black social identity. The assertions of heritage that are typically made reinforce this process, as the concept references a direct connection to identity, but with less regard for accuracy than for the ways in which history can be used for the needs of the present. While this in and of itself is certainly not bad, in this particular context, the concept of heritage has been weaponized. Indeed, this use of heritage is so powerful that these structures have historically served as rallying sites for individuals and groups dedicated to the preservation of racial hierarchy. Because the concept of heritage has positive connotations for most people, it also operates strategically to reposition opposition to the monuments as attacks on persons. And of course, it also raises questions about exactly whose heritage is worth honoring with monuments in public spaces. Given the meanings attached to these monuments, it's no mystery that activists are making the connections between structures symbolizing racial subjugation and the material reality of police violence. Our contemporary moment is one of racial reckoning, and memories of anti-Black violence and the structures that have supported them are an indelible part of that reckoning. Now, one thing to always remember is that progress is never easy, particularly when you factor in the way change threatens group identity and challenges deeply held ideals. The resistance to the removal of these monuments has taken many forms, including legitimate means, such as court and legal actions, and illegitimate means, such as threats of violence. I'd like to speak briefly about a particular mode of resistance that comes across as a compromise measure, but in fact underestimates the work that monuments actually perform. There have been many proposals that deign to leave the monuments intact, with the addition of plaques or some other structures providing context explaining the racist motivations of the honored figure or of the eras that produced the monument. This is inadequate as a solution. People don't always read plaques, and to the extent that they do, written text simply cannot undo or even mitigate the visual influence that the monument itself conveys. Contextual explanations would be correctly seen as more of an afterthought, with the statue itself as the true representation of both the memories on display and the power relations of the time that produced it. If a community wants to convey a message that differs from that of the monument, removal is the better option, really the only option. Many have argued that removal represents the erasure of history. This is false, as monuments do not perform the work of preserving history. They perform the work of venerating the preferred memories of those who were in power at the time. Removal is simply a social action designed to replace one set of memories with another set of memories that is more in line with the desires of the communities in which they are located. In other words, it is an expression of the empowerment of a particular community. And it is important that it is done through official channels, because while unofficial acts such as vandalism and extralegal removal have their place, official removal makes a much stronger statement about empowerment, as well as what the community sees as its values and identity. Many of these monuments are located in communities that are now majority African American or otherwise see themselves as embodying values that are in tension with the messages conveyed through the memorials. Each community has the moral right and obligation to decide for itself what structures should be in place as expressions of who it is. So the question then becomes, what should replace them? This is where African American memory practices become especially useful. Now, I personally believe each community that has advocated successfully for the removal of Confederate monuments should be responsible for making the decisions about what should be done with those spaces. As I mentioned earlier, the structures located in public places speak to the values and identities of entire communities, so the communities themselves should be vested with deciding what those values are and how best to express them. If they decide to replace statues with a flower bed or garden, or perhaps a park of some sort, anything that they decide speaks to their values, that is what should be done. However, if a community decides that another monument presents the best reflection of how it sees itself, African American memory practices, African American memory presents a treasure trove of possibilities. There were many African Americans who fought for their own freedom during the Civil War in both military and civilian roles. And there are many who worked in a variety of capacities and in spite of unimaginable obstacles to make good the unfulfilled promise of emancipation during the 20th century, and in a broader sense, the unfulfilled promise of democracy in America. Because these memories have been forgotten, silenced, or erased over the years, their presentation in public spaces would be truly educational, and there are efforts underway to do this. Take as an example Charlottesville, Virginia, the site of both one of the primary mythologies of American exceptionalism and one of the most notorious scenes of contemporary racial violence enacted under the shadows of a Confederate monument. Charlottesville is of symbolic importance as the town most closely associated with Thomas Jefferson, Vice President, principal author of the Declaration of Independence, one of the so-called founding fathers, and architect of American democracy. The white supremacist rallies that took place there and resulted in the death of activist Heather Heyer in 2017 shone a national spotlight on the city's monument to Robert E. Lee and the role it played as a rallying point for the assorted band of neo-Nazis, neo-Confederates, and other organized hate groups and individuals who saw its threatened removal as an opportunity to enact a program of intimidation and violence. In September of 2020, as a crowd cheered, the Lee statue was removed. This presents an excellent opportunity for Charlottesville's residents to erect a memorial in its place that represents all of its history and is reflective of the inclusive values that should define it as a contemporary community. Though we don't yet know what that will be, there are already efforts to create more inclusive memories in Charlottesville. As but one example, in April of 2020, the city erected a memorial to the enslaved laborers who worked on the grounds of the University of Virginia. And Jefferson's plantation, Monticello, has been the site of some of the more consequential critical orientations toward the history of America's founding, as the memories of his relationship with his slave, Sally Hemings, have been injected into the dominant narratives there, as well as nationally and internationally. For that, we can thank her descendants, as well as activists and historians who worked diligently to move the narratives of their relationship out of the limited realm of oral histories with the help of DNA technologies into wider circulation and added more complicated layers to the mythology surrounding Jefferson. Importantly, there are local activists in Charlottesville who have worked hard to bring to the fore memories of its Black citizens. They have done so using some of the same methods used in the past to offer Eurocentric versions of histories, such as school textbooks and monuments, as well as more non-traditional methods, such as the first-person oral accounts provided through living history speakers. And of course, they have fully availed themselves of digital resources, which are instrumental in teaching school children the important lesson that they themselves can be the historical producers. One positive impact of the events in Charlottesville concerns the renewed realization of making Black history visible and accessible, an impact that continues to this day in it and other cities around the country. The concept of heritage has even undergone a transformation as Black heritage tourism and the profits it brings has ensured that more complete stories are offered at plantation museums. This is one way that neoliberalism has served the objectives of inclusion. Indeed, movements to tear down monuments of subjugation have taken place all over the world, as citizens of countries still grappling with the legacies of imperialism and colonialism have enacted campaigns of removal as part of broader programs of social reform. Statues of Cecil Rhodes were taken down in Zimbabwe in 1980, shortly after it gained its independence, while another statue of Rhodes was dismantled in South Africa in 2015. In June of 2020, inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement, protesters in Bristol, England, toppled a statue of Edward Colston, a 17th century British slave trader. As is the case in the US, these actions have forced a reckoning with these histories of conquest, exploitation, and subjugation, and a reevaluation of the messages embedded in the structures that have glorified them. They also represent a new way in which the relationship between memory and negotiation manifests in the 21st century. The use of reckonings over memorial structures to address the material legacies of the histories they glorify and to propose reparative measures. For example, the removal of the Rhodes statue in South Africa was accompanied by demands that a college education be free and accessible to all, and that the school curricula be decolonized. Our current moment suggests that these efforts will continue into the foreseeable future. I say this not just in terms of responding to the Black Lives Matter movement, but also in terms regarding the threats to democratic governance posed by white supremacy in the impending post-Trump era. These are stories that must be told and told properly in order to enrich our knowledge of all of American history, because Black history is American history, and they are just the beginning. Now, I began this talk with one quote. I'll end with another quote. This one from the great Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History and professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard. Speaking in a 2019 interview about the role of historians in explaining the present by looking at the past, Dr. Higginbotham situated history as the means of achieving a more fair and equitable future. The present doesn't just appear tabula rasa, and it doesn't just appear, she cautioned. There are all kinds of events, visions, and implications that bring us to where we are. I could not have said it better myself, and I'm looking forward to the next several years where we will see exactly where we are and the role of history and memory, and African American history and memory in particular, in getting us there. Thank you.